My name is Dominic Rai. I am a theatre director and writer.
And where were you born?
I was born in Punjab, in East Punjab, and I came to Britain at the age of 5 in 1967, and I grew up in Birmingham, and I have spent most of my life working in the cultural sector, starting in British Asian theatre, as it was known then.
But you're telling me you saw the first kind of Asian play that you saw was in Birmingham by Tara Arts, wasn't it?
That's right. The first piece of British Asian theatre that I saw was in 1984. It was a touring show by Tara Arts, and the actors who were involved will be very familiar. One of them was Paul Bhattacharjee, who sadly died this year. And then there was my friend Harmit Singh Kalirai. He was an actor in that show, and doing all sorts of mime and things. It's very experimental theatre. And taking over from an actor who was cast in the show was Jatinder Verma. He was performing in that show at that time because Andrew Johnson had gone to EastEnders as the first Asian actor. And he left the company much to the chagrin, I think, of Jatinder and Tara Arts. And the other person was Srila Ghosh, who would have gone in to EastEnders. And also involved were two lovely female actors, Sudha Butcher, who went on to form Tamasha, and another actor called Nushaba Khan, who became Shaheen Khan, the actor. So it was a lovely cast of actors, and it was an experimental show, and one that I enjoyed, and I thought, oh, you know, something interesting is happening.
So tell us about this experience. There's something interesting that was happening. What was interesting about it?
Well, I have to say that it's all going to be relative. At the time in Birmingham, I was studying art, fine art in fact, and but I had a lot of friends who were studying to be actors, and in Birmingham we're quite close to Stratford-upon-Avon, so you know, I would have popped over there with these friends at some points, and I also personally took part in amateur theatre. Now, the amateur theatre we took part in would have done shows like Not Now, Darling, you know, farces, you know, very much sort of commercial, Ray Cooney type of things. But amongst those, there was also interesting shows from, you know, new writing from Eastern Europe, you know, especially, and which was of interest to me. And some of the people who contributed to amateur theatre, I belonged to a company called the Birmingham Cooperative Theatre, or the Co-op Theatre, and it was actually funded by the Co-op. So they had money for their productions, although they didn't pay the people contributing. And there was a chap there called Coleman Kelly who taught theatre, and he was the director, and I think he was quite a maverick. So he exposed us to interesting plays from America, as I said, Eastern Europe, and some new writing from Britain. So although it was an overall amateur theatre experience, you know, we knew about Alan Ayckbourn, and we did some of his his plays. I took part in an Alan Ayckbourn play at that time called Confusions. And so that was where I was coming from. So when you're dealing with amateur theatre, it wasn't going to be about Asian people necessarily, okay? We knew about plays like Tea House of the August Moon because Coleman Kelly was really quite a maverick and he knew about new writing, you know, from all over. That was a particular play that I liked. It's by John Patrick and it was about the American occupation of the island of Okinawa. So whilst I say it, you know, in an easy kind of way, amateur theatre, I did know something about theatre, even though I wasn't really a student of theatre, I was studying fine art. And although these plays were interesting, they weren't really speaking to me directly. And Chili in Your Eyes was a devised piece of theatre, and it was racism in London, where it was researched, was very, as it was all over the UK, it was very prominent, and it was, you know, National Front and all that. And this show was researched in Newham, you know, Newham of the Olympics last year. And so it just goes to show that after all this time, 1984 to 2012, a big change has happened. You know, we have 2 London theatres which have artistic directors or directors from British Asian, you know, at the Bush, you know, and at the
Tricycle.
And at the Tricycle. So something has happened in that time, you know. A lot has happened, in fact. So a program like this is very relevant, you know, what the journey has been. And Chili in Your Eyes was researched with young people in Newham, and it picked up on racism and things like that, and the hard. It was set in a wimpy, and there weren't many safe places, I guess, for young people to be mixing at that time, and the wimpy was one of them, perhaps. But it was researched, and the Newham Seven and all these things were happening at that time, but nobody living in Britain would have recognised what they were talking about. And it was a devised show, it was very relevant, and I felt that it was in tune with the times, really. And later on, when I joined Tara Arts the following year as a young actor, I spoke to Harmage about it when I got to know him, and he said, oh yeah, you know, there was even a male rape scene in that play, but nobody took any notice. So big was the issue of racism and the attacks, you know what I mean, that nobody took notice of that, a male rape scene, which was in the play. And so I think that it was genuinely an interesting piece of theatre. It was coming from the ground. It wasn't a classic text. It was speaking to me directly, yes. So that was the difference.
So from that first encounter with British South Asian theatre, you then started to hone a career within this area, didn't you? Would you say?
Well, I had a contract for Tara Arts for a year, and I joined the company, I think, in April '85 with another actor. But at the time, it was the first year, I think, they had full-time funding, although they had the base already, you know, in Garrett Lane, which has been very wonderfully kept, and as you point out, being refurbished. So that is a resource that Tara and Jatinder and the company have kept, you know, until this day, which I'm very pleased and proud of, that it's still there for people. And I had a contract with them for a year, but I actually only stayed, I didn't stay the full year. I then went on to work with Watford Palace. I was more interested in new writing. And so I went on to Watford Palace, to a theatre and education company there, and which had a reputation for commissioning new writers and working with several different kinds of writers. And even in my 2 years there, we did a trip to France and we did all original plays, new plays, which I really liked.
And then you formed, at what point did you form your own company?
Well, in 1989, Jatinder at Victoria Arts got some money to do some commissions. And I think we got a relatively small amount of money, and there were several people, you know, some dance commissions, some theatre, and Tamasha did their first reading of their play, Untouchable at that time. And Paul Bhattacharjee did a show as well. I think it was based on the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, the text written by after the book by Lawrence of Arabia, and I did a commission as well of new writing, which looked at British Asian history in terms of Britain and India. I now realise it was more to do with Punjab and Britain. You know, it wasn't, although we said British Asian, but it was more to do with Punjab. And indeed, it started off with a poem in Punjabi and English. So I was trying to relate to basically, although we called it Indian, for want of a better word, but I think it was about the presence or Punjabi presence in Britain. And it looked at the Punjabi soldiers who took part in First World War. Rasool Kabir was actually played the part of the soldier in that, who you're going to interview. And he played that part several times over 2 or 3 years. And still he'll be able to memorize that monologue, I think. He'll be able to perform it for you if you ever ask him. He did it very well. We looked at the freedom movement at the time, the people who fought for the freedom of India from London as students. And we looked at some of that. The contribution of the Indian soldiers was something that I was very interested in World War I, because I studied history 3 times in school, but I never knew that there were any Indians involved in it in World War I. So that was something that I was very interested in. And later on in my career, I did ask the permission to adapt the only novel about Indian soldiers in World War I, which was by Mulk Rajanand, called Across the Black Waters. He gave us his blessing in '98, and it was adapted by myself and Gerald Wells and performed at Hackney Empire at the 80th anniversary of the end of the First World War.
Talking about new writing, you were saying earlier on that there was a first British Asian play written in the 60s. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
I had the privilege of knowing about a very interesting writer from Southall called Darshan Singh Gyani. And I met him, and he was interviewed for the project with Exeter University, the British Asian Theatre Project, and I interviewed him, and I invited him to be interviewed. He had had a stroke at that time, but as a young man who came from the Punjab, he was a teacher in India. He wrote a play called Atu da Vyah, Atu's Wedding, and it was a comedy, and it was about how people who'd come to Britain, they had more money than the people they'd left back home, and how an older man could marry a younger woman and that sort of thing. But I thought that this was really, at the time, a very sort of like a great act, you know, a great artistic endeavour, because I knew these men were working probably 12, 14-hour days in factories, foundries and other work, and they made time to come together and rehearse a play, an original play, new writing, in Punjabi, rehearse it, and I know that they went from Southall and they performed it in Ealing Town Hall, and which is probably the equivalent of going from, let's say, somewhere like Stratford at that time to the West End. You know, it was such a big endeavour and a great act. And although it falls into what we might say amateur theatre or community theatre, I think the fact that it was an original play puts it up with, you know, plays maybe written by writers 25, 35 years later in that tradition.
So in your own artistic journey, you've written as well, haven't you?
I have. The first commission, it was called Asian Voices, the one for Tara Arts, the one we picked up on Punjabi presence in Britain or England, and Flanders, by the way, not just England, because of the First World War as well. But it was trying to pick up, at the times, the Salman Rushdie affair was happening. So, you know, we were also looking at how images of Asians in the media at that time. Salman Rushdie affair was a very big thing in the news at that time. And also, a couple of years prior to that was the film Gandhi. So, you know, there was a discrepancy somewhere, you know. On the one side, we had this sort of Salman Rushdie. On the other side, we had Gandhi, you know, from Mahatma Gandhi even, you know. And so there was a lot of presence, but there wasn't like any images of young people or the presence here like the one that we saw in Chile in Your Eyes. There wasn't enough of those images. And when you saw telly, you know, you saw negative images, and people, even though they were negative images, people would often say, "Oh, mind your language is on," or you know, "Not, it ain't half hot, mum is on," and people were able to enjoy those things along with all the other diet of telly that everyone watched. So you know, there weren't, no goodness gracious me had happened yet, you know. So so when you saw images in a drama, they were, you know, usually quite derogatively, you know, portrayed, and they were quite images were quite comical, you know, if they were light-hearted at all.
And you wrote, and then you also directed, and you've acted. You've done the whole lot, haven't you?
I would say that I actually stopped acting quite early on, but then I did want to create work, yes, and it started sort of. So I formed Manmila Theatre Company, inspired by portraits, which I developed with Alka Prabhakar. So both of us did that commission for Tara in '89, which was then later became Asian Voices, and so in the 90s, you know, I did form Manmila Theatre Company, yes.
And how was that experience for you, running your own theatre company?
Well, essentially, I wanted to create new writing and new work, and I think that this came into fruition after an attachment at the National Theatre with Jack Bradley, who at the time was the new writing manager. And so I did an attachment with Jack at the new writing department at the National Theatre, and Jack offered me a job to work there, and indeed I read a lot of scripts, you know, and I used to take part in their meetings, which were usually monthly, to read new scripts and discuss them and whatever. And but I decided that really I wanted to use my knowledge and skills to commission new work. So I had a conversation with Jack, and I said, really, you know, I can't do this here, you know, commission new work and things like that. You know, you have your own way of working, but I would like to do things much faster. And so that became, so when I left Jack, really, which would have been at about 99, I wanted to do a commission myself. I was already in touch really with writers that I wanted to commission, and I commissioned 3. And they were Ravi Singh Mangat, who was an East African Sikh, Ashok Patel, who was originally from Leicester and a Gujarati Hindu, and Yasmin Khan, who is now called Yasmin Whitaker Khan, and she was from Bedford. And so we had really a second generation Pakistani British woman being commissioned as well, but all the way to production. So the concept was quite simple, to be setting in a corner shop, and there were 3 different families, a Hindu, Muslim, Sikh family, and the writers, although we agreed on this concept of the corner shop, one was set in a spa, stroke newsagent, one was set in a grocery shop, and one was set in a fabric shop. So we had really the concept there, but the writers were free to tell their own story, and so we had 3 different plays under that banner of the corner shop, and Ravi wrote a beautiful play called Wish, about a father and son relationship, and where the mother has died and they are in the shop together, and all the things that happen. It's quite a magical little play. And Ashok wrote a play about the issue of gay relationships in a Hindu family, and in fact it was a lesbian relationship written by Ashok, a man, and Yasmin wrote about honour killings, and she wrote a play called Resham, which means silk, set in the fabric shop. And we had a cast of 5. We rehearsed all 3 plays in 3 weeks, which is a big task. But and the same cast played all 3 families. The concept was that we changed the part of the dressing of the set from orange, then the door or something became red for Hindu and green for the Muslim family. It's very subtly done, but the idea was to say, look, here's a cast, who are going to play all different families and all different parts. They're all Asian, interesting stories to tell. And it was in the tradition, I think, of East is East, and it was about what it means to be British Asian at that time. That was one of the things. This was never communicated to the writers, but that's one of the things that I was trying to do. There were new writers. It was about encouraging new voices, and really, it went to 21 cities all over the UK. We rehearsed in Tower Hamlets, and although the last show was at the Brady Centre, not the first, we opened in Scotland, and we got our in Glasgow and Stirling and Edinburgh. That's where we got our first reviews, national reviews, and then it went all the way really from Stirling to Broadstairs, in Kent, and we got the same reaction everywhere. It was really enthusiastically seen, and it was really coming at a time when people had seen East is East, in all these remote places as well, and they had seen Goodness Gracious Me, so they were probably more eager to hear new voices as well, from theatre.
So would you say that in your experience of Asian theatre in this country, that there's this common thread that kind of links them all is about the Asian in British society now?
I think the difference really of someone like myself, because I can't really speak for my colleagues, is that although we grew up in Britain, in my case, from the age of 5. Although we grew up in Britain, we were educated here. I grew up in Birmingham, and so we grew up really, bilingually, and for me, or in some cases trilingually even, and so really the expressing yourself in theatre allowed us really, in my case, to use Punjabi very freely, because most of the actors that I wanted to work with, they were bilingual. And in the corner shop, there was a very young actress who I'd seen at Rose Bruford called Pia Khan, and I was so impressed with Pia and her acting skills. She played in a Noel Coward play, and I think it's Blythe Spirit or one of these kind of plays, and she played the part of an older woman, and so well that I was so impressed with her that I wanted her to be in the corner shop, and indeed she played the mother, even though she was in her early 20s, in Yasmin's play, very convincingly, and Yasmin had written some lines in English, and I spoke to Pia and I said, do you agree with me that these should probably be said in Punjabi, because the mother wouldn't say this even on stage, it seems a bit artificial, when it's very emotional, it should be in Punjabi. It doesn't matter if the whole audience can't understand it, but they will be able to know what the mother is saying, from the feeling of it. And Pia was, you had an actress in her early 20s, you had a writer in her 30s, or about 30, and Pia said, yeah, there's no way this mother would be saying this in English, and she said, and I said, can you try saying it in Punjabi? I know we haven't asked Yasmin yet, and Yasmin was quite, she wanted it in English because, she wanted everyone to understand it, and so we had to, Pia improvised on it. She did it in Punjabi, and she did it so well that I thought that really this was expressing that there was now a younger generation of actors, younger than the writer, younger than myself, completely bilingual, who'd been to drama school and confident with their mother tongue. What more could a director like me be asking for? It wasn't that we needed to have it in Punjabi, you know what I mean, because Yasmin had written it in English. But the fact was that it was about authenticity, and that authenticity was about an experience which was very much created here. Had we grown up in Canada, where there is a sizable Punjabi population, since the early part of the 20th century, or even in California, it would be very different, or indeed in France. It was very much saying, we are here, we're in Britain, and, this is who we are. It was saying that.
So this kind of actually is a result of the British transnational journeys that a lot of these families have taken.
Sure, including my own, who have been, like all South Asian families have been affected, or North Indian families, North Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi families have been affected by partition. So in my case also, and theatre is one place where we have transcended partition, because companies are mixed. We don't say this is a Pakistani company, or this is an Indian company, this is a Bangladeshi company. We know that actors, are going to be mixed from all of these communities.
Some people in rural areas of England are saying that that they've never been to theatre, and you, of course, had a piece that was set in a corner shop, which of course happens everywhere in the UK. Have you yourself? Did you ever tour any of your work to rural areas? Seeking new audiences in that way?
Well, I think that the corner shop, which was commissioned in '99 and We got it ready in 2000. We did it in partnership with the Hawth in Crawley and the Arts Council. That did inspire, I think, rural touring. In fact, there was a corner shop created in the West Midlands a few years later, probably just within the last 4 or 5 years. And they did rural touring, by the way, and it was still called the corner shop. So I thought this was very good. And there was a play written around the same time. I forget the name of the writer, in Birmingham, commissioned by a beautiful play at Birmingham Rep, which was also called The Corner Shop. But so I think we had started ours and commissioned it a year or two before, because we were dealing with 3 writers. But there was even a play called The Corner Shop, which came around at the same time. So, or the year later, you know.
So, are there any specific audiences that you aim to reach? Or do you not think about that when you commission writing?
I think that I would now be interested in a more of, I mean, I have only grown up in big cities, so my experience is really urban. So I grew up in a sizable city, you know, Birmingham, and I lived there up to 18 years, and then I spent most of my life in London. So my experience has been very urban, and so really that is the audience. That was my first audience. But now I think I would be interested in more of a rural audience. I think that a play like East is East should and can be produced in Wales. It doesn't matter that there's no Asians involved. You know, they should play the characters. If they want to, they should do, you know, Welsh accents. If they want to, they should set it in Salford. You know, but I think because they are published and texts, you know, they are part of the canon of British theatre. And indeed, I think that I'm even interested that you know, The Corner Shop should be published and performed, and it could be performed, you know, by, you know, all Jewish actors. It doesn't matter, because the experience, the immigrant experience, would be the same whether it was Caribbean. They should, you know, it can be set there, and I think that's something that I was wanting to do. I think this is something to do with publishing the work as well. I'm very much into that. I'm working with a Punjabi poet, and have been for some time, called Mazhar Tirmzi, and he writes in Punjabi. And we've translated his play into English, and now there's been a Welsh translation by Menna Elfyn, who is a very well-known international poet, and we've published it. You know, it's available on Amazon. It's called A Lifetime on Tiptoes. And I like that idea that it can be translated into other languages as well.
I mean, we should say that you're now based in Wales.
I am. Since 2007, I'm based in Cardiff.
Yes, hence talking about all the Welsh connection. Yeah. So you said you were studying art when you were younger. So your family they were quite supportive of your artistic journey. Yes, I think I have a debt to pay to my parents, who you know, despite being the eldest, I wasn't pressurized to become sort of more academic, which is one thing they would have liked, and to be getting sort of like a well-paid job, which is also something they would have wished for me. So I think that you know, the immigrant experience is definitely there was pressure to get married, B, to have a regular job, and B, and C, even to actually be more academic and do well in your studies. And I think all of those things, so I think I was, despite them
I was aware of that pressure, for all those things, and I think that my father and my mother sort of allowed me to develop in the way that I was going to develop. It wasn't how they had intended, by the way. They'd much rather I'd been more academic and got a regular job, and
So you came from a rather stable family, would you say? Nothing, traumatic in any view of life experiences or anything like that?
No, I think on the background with all people from the Indian subcontinent, or certainly North India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, I think they are affected by partition, and I think that's a psychological effect. Maybe I'm speaking only about Punjabis. I mean, I may not. It may be different for different people, but definitely I think that people, Punjabis from East Punjab and West Punjab, which is the most largest population in Britain, by the way, when you add those two things together. When you add the Pakistani Punjabis, which is West Punjab, and the Indian Punjabis, it becomes the largest unit. Hence, sometimes people say that Punjabi is one of second most spoken language. Hence, they say that sometimes. And that makes sense, because that is a sizable population which is here. When you add the two populations, the Indian Punjabis and the Pakistani Punjabis. Of course, it will never come out in records, because anybody who is from Pakistan will always say, the Punjabis will also always say that our mother tongue is Urdu. And Hindus generally will say our mother tongue is Hindi, even if they are Punjabis. So that is historically, it's a sizable group, that one. And hence that, Pir Khan, was able to speak Punjabi in the corner shop, just like a Sikh actor would have done, or a Hindu.
And so this sense of dislocation, has it featured a lot in your work?
I think personally for me, the racism that was there, which was in the 60s, 70s, and picked up in 1984 with Chili in Your Eyes, that has continued, obviously, and it's not gone away, even though the BNP aren't big news, but it probably hasn't gone away. But I think what the Olympics showed was that things have moved on a lot. Even British Asian theatre has moved on a lot, And I think the kind of work that we will create now, I hope, will be more international work. Like, for example, the way that I'm working with Mazhar Tirmizi. I want it to be published. I want it to be published in Punjabi. I want it to be published in English, translation, and indeed we're publishing it in 3 languages. So when I do that production, hopefully in a couple of years' time, it'll probably be trilingual. It won't matter that some of the actors, we won't be thinking that the Welsh-speaking actors are the ones who are going to be speaking only in Welsh. It'll be much more mixed than that. And I think that's the kind of theatre that I hope, or was hoping for 10 years ago even, when I was, I was thinking that that's the way casting might have happened. But, obviously people, we weren't ready for doing that. I think it does need writers of the caliber of Mazhar Tirmizi who've got things to say, which are much more than, in the language they're writing in, and we want to share them with a wider audience. And so I'm even thinking that this needs to be available on iTunes. So we're recording the play. I'm working with Mazhar to record it in Punjabi, and it is written in a folk style. And then it will audio will be available in Welsh and English as well. So
what do you think are the changes that are happening in British Asian theatre?
Well, for myself, it's that journey, basically. I will be making things available on iTunes, audio downloads as well. And I think it's very important that, we use technology that's available to us at our time. And so it fits in very well with that project about partition, because the original is in Punjabi. I have an English translation. You can read it. We want you to be able to hear it and download it. But when we do the production, you know, if I direct it and produce it, then it will be trilingual. But there's nothing to stop anyone else doing it only in Welsh, or only in English, or only in Punjabi. You know, I'd welcome that.
So would you say the themes are being reinvented in different styles of writing and portrayal?
Well, I think that theatre itself is quite a luxury. You know, to be working in theatre is a privilege and a luxury. And I think that the number of actors and directors and writers and designers and stage managers, let's not forget them, is very limited, you know, who are making their money out of it. And I think that it's a very special thing to be working in theatre or any of the performing arts professionally. But I think that the technology is enabling us to create work in different ways. And so, you know, you do not have to be, you know, in London, supported by some funder, you know, or funders to be able to create work. Technology will enable us to do it in different ways and to put it out in the world as well. I hope that more interesting work will be created, you know, using technologies as well, you know. So when I was artists in residence at the Brady Centre and at Eastside Arts between 2002 and 2003, we did something called Stories Not for Texting. And that picked up on Bangladeshi sort of young people's stories, but using technology. And I think that there was a way of communicating some of those stories which couldn't be told in any other way. But texting at that time was a very important way of doing it.
You've spoken very fondly of some of your past work. Does any one of it stand out to you that you feel is really important to your life or had a huge impact?
Well, I think the work that one of the pieces that I'm very, you know, proud of, which goes to my grandfather's generation, who came to Britain in 1960 from Malaysia, is that in my extended family we had Urdu writers. These are Punjabis who were writing in Urdu, which was then the lingua franca and the language of learning in North India. And I came across really a translation of feminist Urdu poetry called We Sinful Women. And I had been taught the Urdu script by my grandfather before I learnt the ABC. So coming from that community where there were several prominent Urdu writers, you know, I as an adult learned to read and write Urdu because it was sort of part of my heritage. And so Rukhsana Ahmed did this translation, which was prompted by Rumana Mahmood, who I knew and worked with. So Rumana had suggested that this piece of work should be done, the contemporary feminist Urdu poetry from Pakistan. And I had the privilege of creating a show called We Sinful Women. And it was performed bilingually in Urdu and English, and it toured nationally. We did it in 95-6. It toured nationally, and so I mean, that's something that I'm fond of, you know, because it was connecting something which had happened, you know, here, there and then in Britain. You know, the translator was here, Ruxana Ahmed. It was prompted by someone called Rumana Mehmood, who I knew, and it was connecting to my heritage from my grandfather's generation. Indeed, my father was an Urdu poet as well. So, but they were well-known poets in my extended family and community. So that was something I was proud of because I wanted to connect. There was a disconnect really between East and West Punjab, and so I think if there's a overall theme in my work, it is looking at the effect of that, really, because Mazhar Tirmizi's family, the writer that I'm working with now, comes from East Punjab, which is now the Indian Punjab, and I have friends and family who are from the other side as well, who then had to move. So I think partition has played a big part, and it's actually played out in the plays that we are seeing and writing subsequently. And so it's a big theme in my own work. And I'd say that the other thing is really the what we used to call the Asian presence in Britain. Then we started to interchangeably call it the Indian, the Pakistani, the Bangladeshi presence. But I think that I am now quite happy to say that really probably it was the Punjabi presence. And indeed I have come across, when there was no signs of the Indian soldiers in World War I in Britain, in '98 when I did that play, it was in Ypres, in Belgium, where there are the names of all the soldiers whose bodies were not found. I saw my own family name and several other people's family names written there, you know, and so I knew that they had, you know, even though I came from a soldiering family and studied history and the First World War 3 times, I never knew there were Indians in World War I. So I'm looking for a revival of Across the Black Borders, probably in 2016.
So that's great. That's great. It's wonderful aim to have. So to finish off, is there anything else you'd like to kind of tell us that we've missed out? I'm sure we've missed out a lot, but you know, any one thing that stands out?
Well, I think that people like myself, you know, we have been inspired and contributed to British theatre. You know, I wouldn't like to necessarily compartmentalise it too much now. You know, there was a need, I think, in the 80s to compartmentalise these things much more. Now I think it should be much more on a story you have to tell and the relevance of that story and wanting to share it with an audience. It doesn't matter what the size of that audience is or who that audience is. I think it should be more about that. Of course, there are, you know, tiers of work going on, and you know, we saw a Shakespeare, you know, productions last year and a few years earlier in the West End, and I think that these works and black work, you know, in the West End, I'm really pleased and proud of that, you know, as well. You know, currently playing Fences, you know. And I think that it's very important that these works are happening at every level, not just at the community level, but that we can see them, you know, in the West End too, and that the RSC is able to do these works as well as the national, you know, and that they happen because they are, you know, good plays worth sharing with an audience. That's something that I feel very, you know, strongly about, that really there's an affinity of artists wanting to contribute to national culture here. You know, well before there were any theatre companies, there were people coming together and performing. And they perform for a reason. They perform to entertain themselves. Sometimes like the Pit, Doha, they were, you know, they had a particular theme because Krishan Chandra was a socialist and they had a particular message to give. the Indian Workers Association, socialist. And then there were artists like Darshan Singh Gyani, who had contact really with India, and quite an extraordinary level of artists from India. One of the foremost Punjabi poets, Amrita Pritam, came to stay with him at his house. They would come, even like big film stars often came to visit and stay with him. He was a teacher in India, and so people like Darshan Singh Gyani here in Wales, where I'm based now in Cardiff since 2007. There is Harbhajan Preet, who was an East African Asian, and he's done work here, and he wrote original plays, and they were performed. And I think that long before there was Tara Arts, there were these artists, and they were not only writing work, they were performing work, rehearsing work, and they were taking it out to audiences. There has been a disconnect with that generation, because they were writing in the case that I know, that like in Punjabi or maybe Bengali or Gujarati. So they're writing in their mother languages. But I think there's a time now to really acknowledge those people and say that, yes, it's because they did that we're able to do this. And I think that, there has been that disconnect. Maybe we can acknowledge their work really as well. I'm quite interested to translate parts of Atu's Wedding, by Darshan Singh Gyani, and making it available, and maybe even recording it, as a play.
I think that's wonderful. That's really great. Yeah. Okay.
So that's it. Yeah. So I think that nobody has invented British Asian theatre, but people have had stories to tell. They've been telling them, and I think that as we are, the more integrated we become here. Like, for example, I'm based in Wales. It was very important for me to have a very important play by Mazhar Tirmizi, A Lifetime on Tiptoes, Umran Langiya Babar, a play that he wrote. Also, not only translated into English, but also into Welsh. And when it is produced, that it's going to be in 3 languages. That's very important.
Wonderful, thank you.